Welcome to This Week in Africa. I'm bringing you 5 days of news from a continent of 54 nations, the stories that shape the week, the facts behind the headlines, and the larger meaning that too often gets left on the cutting room floor. From a presidential election in West Africa to a military airstrike on a market in the northeast, from a junta in the Sahel dismantling civil society to a devastating bus explosion in southern Africa, this was not a quiet week. Let's get into it. We begin in West Africa, where Benin held a presidential election on April 12th, and by Monday the 13th, the results were in. Finance Minister Romuald Wadagni won with over 94% of the vote, confirmed this week by Benin's Constitutional Court. Voter turnout stood at 58.75%. Wadagni, 49, is the hand-picked successor of outgoing President President Talon, who stepped down after reaching the constitutional limit of 2 5-year terms, a rare act in a region where leaders too often find ways to stay. On the surface, this looks like democratic continuity. A country held an election, the incumbent respected term limits, power was transferred. And that matters. It genuinely matters on a continent where coups in Burkina Faso, Mali, Guinea, and Niger have become near routine in the last 5 years. But look closer and the picture is more complicated. Benin's main opposition party, the Democrats, failed to win enough parliamentary seats in January's legislative elections to qualify for official representation. They needed 20% and received 16%. Without parliamentary endorsement, opposition candidates couldn't get on the presidential ballot. So Wadagni faced essentially no real competition, and his 94% result reflects that. The incoming president also faces a deepening security crisis in the country's north, where the Al-Qaeda affiliate JNIM has launched repeated attacks. In March alone, 15 Beninese soldiers were killed in one such assault. The question for Wadagni's presidency is whether economic management skills, his background, translate into the political and military responses a country on the edge of the Sahel crisis now urgently needs. We cannot leave West Africa without confronting something far darker that happened this week in Nigeria. On the night of April 11th, a Nigerian Air Force strike hit Jilli Market, located along the Borno-Yobe border in northeastern Nigeria. By Monday the 13th, the story had broken internationally. Amnesty International's Nigeria director confirmed to journalists that at least 100 civilians were killed, and some local officials and a traditional chief put the figure as high as 200. Images emerging from the scene included children among the casualties. The Nigerian military confirmed a strike took place under Operation Hadin Kai, its long-running counter-terrorism operation against Boko Haram and the Islamic State West Africa province. But the government's response has been deeply troubling. Rather than accepting accountability, the federal government insisted this week that the strike was deliberate and intelligence-led, claiming the market was a known Boko Haram supply point, that the area had been designated a restricted zone, and citing the arrest of a 15-year-old alleged courier as justification after the fact. Let us be clear about what is at stake here. Even accepting the government's framing, a strike that kills dozens to over 100 civilians at a market, regardless of what activity also took place there, demands an independent investigation and full accountability. Amnesty International has called for exactly that. The Associated Press has documented that at least 500 civilians have died in similar Nigerian Air Force misfires since 2017. That is not a pattern of isolated incidents. That is a systemic failure. Africa's most populous nation is fighting a real and brutal insurgency in its northeast. That fight is legitimate, but a military that cannot distinguish between a market and a militant base, or worse, that claims it can and strikes civilians anyway, is not winning a war.
It is losing the trust of the very communities whose cooperation is essential to defeating armed groups that have thrived for over a decade precisely because of governance failures in the region. Staying in the Sahel, though moving west, this week Burkina Faso's military government made its most sweeping assault on civil society to date. On April 15th, the Ministry of Territorial Administration announced the dissolution of 118 NGOs and associations with an immediate ban on their activities. Many of the dissolved organizations were involved in human rights documentation and advocacy.
On the right to freedom of association, adding that the move violated Burkina Faso's own constitution and its obligations under the African Charter on Human and People's Rights. This is not happening in a vacuum. Since Captain Ibrahim Traoré seized power in a 2022 coup, Burkina Faso has dissolved all political parties, expelled French forces, partnered with Russian security contractors, passed a law criminalizing same-sex relations, banned independent media from reporting on security operations, and ordered all NGOs to move their funds to a state-controlled bank. In July 2025, a law was passed further restricting civil society operations. Now, 118 organizations are banned. Here is the Pan-African contradiction we must name honestly. The juntas of Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger present themselves as defenders of African sovereignty, liberating their countries from French neocolonialism, standing up for the dignity of their people. And there is real grievance underneath that rhetoric. French military presence in the Sahel failed to stop the insurgency. Decades of structural adjustment policies hollowed out state capacity. Western institutions condescended, but sovereignty cannot mean the right of a military junta to silence every organization trying to protect civilians from both jihadist violence and state abuse. Sovereignty cannot mean arresting journalists, disappearing opposition figures, and dissolving the groups that document the disappearances. The people of Burkina Faso deserve better than a choice between jihadist terror and junta repression, and a Pan-African politics worthy of the name must be willing to say so. In southern Africa on Thursday the 16th, Zimbabwe was struck by a tragedy on the road. A commuter minibus, a Toyota Quantum Combi packed with passengers who were mourners returning from a funeral in Nkayi, caught fire and exploded on the Bulawayo-Beitbridge Highway between Chipangali Wildlife Orphanage and the Gwanda toll gate. At least 18 people died. Some bodies were burned beyond recognition. There were no survivors among those on board. The Zimbabwe Republic Police confirmed the deaths that afternoon, and President Emmerson Mnangagwa declared a state of disaster before the end of the day. The cause of the explosion remains under investigation. Forensic teams have been deployed. Authorities have not yet confirmed what detonated. The Bulawayo-Beitbridge Road is one of Zimbabwe's most heavily traveled highways, the main artery connecting the country to South Africa, and it has a grim history of fatal accidents. What is not yet known is as important as what is. We report this for what it is. 18 people got into a vehicle to travel home after burying someone they loved, and they never arrived. They had families, they had lives, and they deserve to be more than a statistic in a week's news cycle. Also in South Africa this week, and crossing into the political sphere, Julius Malema, founder and leader of the Economic Freedom Fighters, was sentenced on Thursday, April 16th to 5 years in prison by a magistrate in Kugompo City, formerly known as East London. The conviction stems from an incident at an EFF rally in 2018 where Malema fired between 14 and 15 live rounds in front of 20,000 supporters at a stadium in the Eastern Cape. He was convicted in October 2025 of unlawful possession of a firearm, illegal discharge in a public place, and reckless endangerment. He had pleaded not guilty,
claiming the weapon was a toy. His lawyers immediately applied for and were granted leave to appeal. Malema remains a free man while the case heads to the Eastern Cape High Court. Under South Africa's constitution, a confirmed sentence of 12 months or more would bar him from parliament for 5 years, a consequence that would significantly reshape the country's opposition landscape ahead of the 2027 elections. The EFF said this week the sentence will have no effect on the party's performance in upcoming local government elections. Their supporters gathered by the hundreds outside the court, and the party's position is that this prosecution is political, an attempt to remove one of the most vocal opposition voices in the country from the public stage. South African law must run its course. At the same time, the fact that this case involves a prominent black opposition leader who built his movement on demanding land reform, economic redistribution, and confronting white economic dominance means it cannot be read in a purely legal vacuum. The political stakes are too high, and too many South Africans are watching to see whether the rule of law applies equally or selectively.
On the economic front, it was a week that showed how tightly connected Africa is to global instability, even when that instability is happening thousands of kilometers away. The ongoing conflict in the Middle East and its disruption of shipping through the Strait of Hormuz sent fuel prices surging across the continent this week. In Kenya, the Energy and Petroleum Regulatory Authority announced price reviews on April 14th that pushed super petrol in Nairobi to over 206 shillings per litre, a rise of nearly 29 shillings, while diesel surged by over 40 shillings. By Tuesday the 15th, President Ruto had announced a halving of VAT on petroleum products from 16% to 8% for 90 days, backed by a 6.2 billion shilling government subsidy. Parliament passed the enabling legislation on April 16th in a single session, and the President signed the Value-Added Tax Amendment Bill into law today, April 17th, backdating the relief to the 15th. The immediate impact: petrol is now capped at 197 shillings per litre, diesel at 196 shillings. Kerosene, the fuel of the poor, the fuel of boda operators and small traders, remains unchanged. This moment crystallizes a challenge that faces nearly every African government right now. Oil importing nations, which is most of sub-Saharan Africa, are absorbing shocks they did not create. The World Bank, in its Africa Economic Update released April 8th, projected that the Middle East conflict will push regional inflation to 4.8% in 2026 and has already forced a downward revision of Africa's growth forecast. Sub-Saharan Africa is still expected to grow at 4.1% this year, the same pace as 2025. But the downside risks, in the bank's own words, have intensified. The deeper issue is this: Africa's public debt service costs have doubled over 8 years, from 9% of government revenue in 2017 to 18% in 2025. Public capital investment remains 20% below 2014 levels. The continent is running to stand still. And when an external shock arrives, whether it is a pandemic, a war in Europe, or a conflict in the Gulf, African governments are forced to make emergency interventions that drain fiscal space they cannot afford to lose. The Pan-African response to this cannot simply be reactive. It has to be structural. The African continental free trade area must deepen. African energy interdependence, renewable and fossil, must be developed regionally, not left to foreign import chains that can be disrupted by geopolitics halfway around the world. The continent is home to the mineral resources that will power the global clean energy transition. The continent cannot allow itself to be the provider of raw materials and the absorber of external shocks indefinitely. And this week in Mauritania, From April 13th to 17th, African agriculture ministers met for the 34th session of the FAO Regional Conference for Africa in Nouakchott. The agenda: food security, climate resilience, and how to feed a continent whose population is growing faster than its agricultural productivity. It received far less coverage than the politics. It deserved more, because the daily reality for hundreds of millions of Africans is not about which politician was convicted or which junta dissolved which NGO. It is about whether there is enough food, whether the rains came, whether the market price for maize is affordable. The stories that matter most are sometimes the ones told least. That is, this week in Africa, a presidential handover in Benin, a devastating military strike on a market in Nigeria that killed civilians whose names we still don't know. A junta in Burkina Faso silencing 118 organizations that stood between ordinary people and impunity. 18 mourners killed in a burning minibus on a Zimbabwean highway. A political sentence in South Africa that will shape the next election. And a continent absorbing the economic shocks of a war it has no part in. Africa is not a tragedy. Africa is a place where 1.4 billion people are building lives, raising children, building businesses, holding elections, demanding accountability, and writing a future under conditions that the rest of the world should be honest enough to acknowledge were not created in isolation. We'll be back next week with more.